Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to the ICANN initiative, the Hindu and Indian Express analysis. We will start today with the story of Mr. Sonam Wangchuk. As we all know, it is the same story that we saw in the movie Three Idiots. He was basically a native of Ladakh, and since childhood he saw that there was a lot of water problem in the region. So he came out with an innovative solution of the ice stupa. So during the winter seasons, the water was brought from upstream to the downstream, and then when water was sprayed in the form of a fountain, while coming back it would freeze and it would form a stupa. And this water would melt in the summer seasons, and it would cater to the needs of the people in plantation in the summer season, so that there was no water scarcity. So this was one unique thing that he began. Also, he took a lot of steps to tackle the plastic pollution that was becoming very prevalent in the Ladakh region by segregating, recycling and upcycling them. Then he also promoted a cultural preservation in Ladakh. And he said one very beautiful thing, that planet doesn't need money, it needs behavioral change. So to tackle various issues that the planet is facing, what is most important is the behavioral change. For example, he himself stopped ironing all his clothes. And then he said that so much of energy, so much of electricity can be saved from this. So very small things will play a large role in safeguarding in our planet as a whole in the future. He also started what is called as a SECMOL, that is Students Educational and Cultural Movement of Ladakh. So in this, he takes some 70 to 100 students there who have failed in the 10th board exams. So, and then these people will learn there and live there, and they have learning experiences there. So they learn by doing things. They even do farming, they produce food, they solve even real life problems like climate change. So they search for alternatives to how to tackle climate change and how to improve energy efficiency and all that. He has also come out with what is called as solar mud buildings. So these solar mud buildings are prefabricated, movable buildings, and they are eco-friendly huts for the soldiers in the cold. So because with this solar mud buildings, even if the outside temperature is minus 20 degrees Celsius, within it will be 20 degrees Celsius. So it will be comfortable inside, and it requires no heating at all. So the cost of heating is zero here. So these huts are extremely eco-friendly and are very useful for our soldiers. So these are some of his contributions. With this, we will start with the first topic of the day, which is the India and the Indian Ocean. So the editorial spoke about the importance of the Indian Ocean Association and also the role that India plays in this. So it first of all talks about the Sagar initiative. So Sagar is security and growth for all in the region, and this was started in the year 2015. So this means that there has to be cultural and economic linkages between the countries in the Indian Ocean. There must be peace and prosperity for all. So former Ambassador S. Jaishankar has said about the Indian Ocean, that has said about Sagar at the 4th Indian Ocean Conference, that India's Sagar is consultative, it is democratic, and it is equitable. It is consultative, democratic, and equitable also. And recent development is India has got an observer status in the Indian Ocean Commission. So this shows the importance of India in the Indian Ocean region to maintain peace and prosperity. And with this, India's relations with the Indian Ocean Commission countries will also improve. So these countries include Comoros, Madagascar, Mauritius, Reunion Islands, and Seychelles. So with these countries also, India's relations will improve in the future. And also Indian Ocean Commission has involved in, it has taken a leadership role in the maritime security domain in the Western Indian Ocean. So in this region also, India's role will increase because it has got the observer status in the Indian Ocean Commission. So with this, let us try to understand the importance of the Indian Ocean. When we talk about the Indian Ocean, as we saw in the figure in the picture on the first slide, it links both the west and the eastern half. So it actually provides this link, and we can also see from that picture how there are several choke points that belong to the Indian Ocean region, like the Malacca Strait, the Hormuz Strait, the Bab el Mandeb. So these are all the important choke points which are there in the Indian Ocean, through which the global trade and commerce will go through. So it is a very critical gateway also, and it is very important for sea lanes of communication. Even oil from the Persian Gulf will go through the Indian Ocean. And so therefore we know that in the Indian Ocean, it has 40% of the world population is there in the Indian Ocean. So this huge population itself makes the whole region extremely important. And also from the world trade point of view, 50% of the world's containerized cargo passes through this region. Then 2/3 of the world's oil shipment also passes through this region. And also third, if we talk about, this is about the economy, the global commerce. And then if we talk about the resources in the region, it has nearly 40% of the world's oil and natural gas reserves. It has 60% of the world's uranium reserves and 40% of gold reserves, and also nearly 98% of the world's diamond. So all these are found in the Indian Ocean region. So this makes it extremely important. And also we keep with this and economic extraction of these minerals, we also keep talking about the blue economy. So this makes the region very important. For India also it is very important, because India has the right to explore these minerals in its exclusive economic zone. So this again shows the important. And for India, it imports 70% of its oil requirements is imported by India. So most of this oil goes through the Indian Ocean region only. And 95% of India's global trade by volume happens through sea itself. So this shows the importance of the Indian Ocean. And also it is very important for the marine fisheries, marine resources. It is very important. So it is estimated that there will be 12 million tons of marine fisheries. That is the output in the Indian Ocean region. So all of these things shows what is the importance of the Indian Ocean region. Now we will see what is the nature of engagements that India is having with the Indian Ocean in the Indian Ocean. The first type of engagement is through exercises. So these exercises could be bilateral or multilateral. For example, we have Milan exercises, we have Malabar. In Malabar, United States, India and Japan participate. We have Osindex with Australia, we have Varuna with France, we have L'Amitié with Seychelles, Cobra Gold. So many such exercises are there. So you can just mention a few names. The second type of engagement we have is the anti-piracy engagement. This is particularly off the coast of Somalia. There is a specific group called as contact group for anti-piracy off the coast of Somalia. So this anti-piracy operations is also very important. That is another nature of engagement that we have with the Indian Ocean region. Third is the HADR, which is humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. For example, where there is any oil pollution or during a disaster, it could be the search and rescue operations. So in all these, India is engaged. Then the next type of engagement is a counter-terror engagement. So there will be patrols. For example, we have these patrols very regularly with Sri Lanka, Mauritius, Maldives and Seychelles. We have the counter-terror patrols very regularly. So this helps us to upscale our surveillance in the region, so that to ensure that Indian Ocean is not used as a launch pad to launch terror activities in the region. Then the next type of engagement is through developmental assistance. One example for this is that we have funded several developmental activities in the Indian Ocean region. For example, there is an MOU between India and Mauritius on rural development. So this shows our development assistance in the region. Then sixth type of engagement is our collaboration through various forums. For example, as we have recently seen, Indian Ocean Commission, or Indian Ocean Rim Association. So through several such fora, we have engagement in the region. Then the seventh type is through the economic relations. We have collaborations with regard to the blue economy, how to harvest the marine resources in a sustainable manner. And the most important of all is the strategic presence in the Indian Ocean. For that, we have Project Mausam also, which India propounded after the Maritime Silk Road initiative of China. Then, as we just now saw, we have Sagar initiative. Then, as part of Quad also, then there is Indian Maritime Security Summit is also there. So all of these things form a part of our strategic presence in the Indian Ocean region. So these are the various forms and nature of the engagement that India has in the Indian Ocean region. Now let's look at some of the issues that are there in the region. The first thing is the China's presence. China's presence in the recent times, China's presence, particularly naval presence in the Indian Ocean region, has increased. For example, it already has military outpost in Djibouti, in Gwadar also. Then in Gwadar it is building, it is helping Pakistan, then Hambantota in Sri Lanka. So what is called as a string of pearls, or so that is there. So important shipping lanes, China is gaining control. So it is the China's presence. It also has military, it is also giving military support to Myanmar and Bangladesh. The Belt and Road Initiative is there. So all of this shows the increasing Chinese dominance in the Indian Ocean region. So that this is one of the concern. The second is the concern of piracy. As we see that, saw that 2/3 of the oil shipment and a large amount of the international container cargo also goes through this region. So piracy is a very important issue, especially in the Gulf of Aden. It's a very important issue. Then third is, there are several, when we talk about the challenges in the Indian Ocean region, they can be grouped as traditional challenges and non-traditional challenges. Traditional challenges is like the maritime boundary issue, for instance, which India has with Pakistan in the Sur Creek, or it had with Bangladesh. Then among the non-traditional issues comes the biodiversity threats, climate change, human trafficking, terrorism, unscientific fishing. All of these are the non-traditional challenges that are there. So after this, we will see what should be the conclusion whenever we are talking about India's role in the Indian Ocean region. The first thing is that India has always advocated for a free and open Indo-Pacific. So this should be our ultimate goal always. So this means what? We must have freedom of navigation everywhere. There has to be rule of law. So the countries must abide by the United Nations Convention on the Laws of Seas. Then there must be free and transparent economic trade across the countries. Then we also have to invest our time and efforts in what is called as maritime governance, to come out with principles that we should, all the countries in the region should abide, so that there is progress for all in the region. And India has also been traditionally acting as the regional security provider. So this is a very important keyword. So India has acted as a regional security provider, and it must continue to improve its role as a regional security provider. And what also we are immensely blessed with is our soft power. So our soft power has to be used to a more extent to extend our sphere of influence in the Indian Ocean region. So on these lines, we have to conclude. So then we will move to the next topic. Before that, we can, whenever a question is asked on India and Indian Ocean region, you can just draw the Indian Ocean region, and you can point out some important, for example, India has a base in Seychelles, China is having in Djibouti. Similarly, China has in Gwadar, it has in Chittagong and Sitwe in Myanmar, so Hambantota in Sri Lanka. So all of these can be pointed out to show India's presence in the Indian Ocean region, and also how other countries like China are increasing their dominance. Alright, so this is the same thing. India has an MOU with Seychelles to build the airstrip and docking facility, an MOU with Mauritius to build airstrip and docking facility. And you can also show, when you draw the diagram of the Indian Ocean, show the important choke points like Strait of Malacca, Strait of Hormuz, Bab el Mandeb. All these choke points can be shown to show the importance of the Indian Ocean region. So now we'll move to the next topic, which is the center state issues. So this is a small example that can be quoted in answers whenever any question is asked on the emerging center state issues. So here what has happened is, because of the COVID, states are taking several steps to tackle at their own end. But the central government has sent some central teams to go and to see what is happening in the states, what measures have been taken, what needs to be done, etc. So here the West Bengal Chief Minister has objected to the visit of these central teams, saying that so this was more unilateral, because public health already comes in the under the state. So the states are responsible for that, and they're already taking all the measures that they had to look into this crisis. So at this point of time, why the center had to send its central teams? So this is more unilateral. So this is an issue that has emerged between the center and the state, that too at a time of the crisis. So this can be quoted as an example in questions that ask about analyzing the recent trends in the center state issues. So next is about data protection. So why this issue has come up is Kerala government had entered into an agreement with an US-based company that's called as Sprinklr. So what this company will do is, it is going to process the data of the patients, COVID patients in Kerala. So this company can collect and process all the data related to the patients, which now number for more than 2 lakh. So 2 lakh persons of data has been collected and processed by this US-based company. So why this has been in news, what has it got to do with data protection, is that first of all, this medical information is a sensitive information. It's a personal sensitive information. And when the Supreme Court gave the judgment under the Puttaswamy case as the right to privacy being a part of the fundamental right, so Supreme Court also held that medical information will be a part of sensitive information, which has to be protected. Its privacy has to be protected. So, but in this case, the medical history, medical information of more than 2 lakh patients are being shared with this particular US-based company. So that is the first issue, that sensitive medical information is being shared. Second, the Kerala government has also agreed to the condition by the company that any legal issues regarding the contract between the two will be dealt with in the United States court, and all the data that has been collected about the patients will be stored in US servers. So this has given rise to the issue of data protection, and now a PIL has been filed in the court that this is violating the right to privacy of these patients. With this, we will see something about data protection as such. So first of all, we will see why do we need data protection. So for this, you can go on quoting several things along with statistics. For example, we have Aadhaar enrollment. So most of the population has enrolled for Aadhaar. Then privacy, according to the Supreme Court in the Puttaswamy case, is already a fundamental right. And then we have also increasing and promoting the ecosystem for digital payments. Then we have Facebook, WhatsApp. In fact, there are more than 500 million active web users in India. So our online market is second only to China. So this is there. We have also faced instances in the past, like the world has seen instances like the Cambridge Analytica example. So this shows why data protection is important. Otherwise, we could be our decisions could also be influenced because of these the online processes. So then this is why data protection is very important. And when we realize the importance of data protection, as way back in 2012 itself, the AP Shah committee was set up. So AP Shah committee laid down some 9 principles that were based on the OECD guidelines. data privacy framework look like? So first of all, there has to be notice to the people that their data is going to be they're collected, and then choice and consent. So their consent has to be taken, and they have to be given a choice whether they can allow their data to be collected or not. Then third is there has to be collection limitation. That means the collection has to be for only that much amount of data which is required is only should be collected, and not more than that should be collected. Then is a purpose limitation. Purpose limitation is only that data which serves the purpose must be collected. So, and then is access and correction. Access and correction means a person whose data has been collected can request access to that data, and if any correction is needed to be done in that data, he must also be able to do that. Then is display of information, or that is openness or transparency. It means that there has to be more openness regarding whose data was collected, what was the purpose of collecting the data, if and when the data was destroyed. So all of that openness should be there. And then accountability. Accountability means that if there is any breach in the security of somebody's data, then the concerned people will have to be held accountable for that, and they must be penalties must be levied on them. So these were some of the this was part of the framework which the P Shah committee came out with in the year 2012 itself. So we will see about the data protection bill that was recently been introduced in the parliament. So first of all, after the case Puttaswamy case about the right to privacy, the government had set up an expert committee under B.N. Sri Krishna to draft a data protection bill. But there were several reservations with that bill, and finally this 2019 bill which came in December, the bill came recently. So it has several provisions. So the first thing, it talks about the consent, which means that the data fiduciaries, that means those people who are holding the data of people in the trusted capacity. So these data fiduciaries must first get the consent of the concerned person that their data is going to be collected. And even in the case of children, if a child's data is to be collected, then consent is to be obtained from the parents or from the guardians. But this also has a negative side, because it has a wide definition of the fiduciaries. So this can range from anything between a ride-sharing app to a social media platform or data brokers. Anybody can be fiduciary. So firstly, it has a very vague definition of fiduciary. So this is the issue that is related with the consent. And also the second issue with the consent is that there are several exemptions that are given. That means in some cases the consent of the concerned person need not be taken. For example, while enforcing a law. So enforcing a law itself is again a very wide, vague term. Then while providing public services. So again, providing public services is a vague term. So it could range between so many things. So second is that it has several exemptions, and also it says that if it serves some reasonable purpose. So again, reasonable purpose is very vague. So there is a lot of ambiguity and vagueness when it comes to taking consent. There is a wide definition of fiduciaries. There are a lot of exemptions given, and there is vagueness and ambiguity in the reasonable purpose. So this is the first. The second thing is that it talks about the rights that people have, the rights of the people. So first, that the people will have to know that their data, that their information is being collected. So that is how they have the right to give a consent. And second, they have the right to correct the data if they feel that some data is wrong. And there is also the right to be forgotten. That means if they feel that the data that is being collected about them needs to be erased, it has to be erased, and all the digital trail about that particular person has to be forgotten. So this the bill also talks about the rights of the people. And thirdly, it talks about data localization. What does data localization means? various companies will be collecting data related to us, and these data will have to be housed within India. For determining the data localization norms, the bill has divided the data into three categories. One is the data that is called as critical personal data. The second category of data is called as sensitive personal data, and the third category is the general data. So the critical personal data will have to be housed and processed only in India. It cannot be taken outside India. In the case of sensitive personal data, which means information related to somebody's finance, health, sexual orientation, biometric, genetics, so all these are sensitive personal information. These will also have to be housed in India, but with the consent of the concerned person, with the consent of the user whose data this pertains to. With that consent, it can be taken out of India also for processing. So this is the second thing about the data localization norms. Then the third provision, the fourth provision related to the data protection bill is that it has an independent regulator. So this regulator is called as the Data Protection Authority, which will oversee the entire process, and it will also audit the cases of data collection and processing, whether it was done for genuine purposes or not. So there is an independent regulator. Third is that there is in each company there has to be a data protection officer. There has to be a data protection officer who will provide for any grievance redressal, and the officer will also maintain records regarding whose data, what data was collected, and what is the purpose and all that. That record maintenance will also be done by the data protection officer. Next, the bill talks about the purpose limitation. So as I said, purpose limitation is it has to be for a limited purpose, not that all data is about an individual is being collected. So whatever is needed for the purpose, only that much has to be collected. Then it also talks about collection limitation. So again, collection limitation is only limited amount of data has to be collected, not that everything can be collected. So which means that the data that is getting collected, it should be for a clear, specific, and it should also be for a lawful purpose. So only then the data could be collected. Then it also talks about data portability. So it is about the transferability of the data. So this again comes under the right of the person whose data it is. Then it talks about the penalty also under the bill, so which says that it has to be 5 crore or 2% of the worldwide turnover of the company. So this is a case of minor penalty, or it will be 15 crore or 4% of the worldwide turnover would be the major penalty. So these are some of the provisions under the proposed bill. Now we will see some of the advantages of the particular bill and some of the demerits of the bill. So when we talk about the merits of the bill, so first it has the localization norms. So when data is localized, it helps the law enforcement agencies in collecting those data, investigation, and and prosecution. So in that, it will help the law enforcement agencies. Now, without the data localization, all the data is taken to servers, say in the United States. So whenever our law enforcement agencies need access to any data, then it has to be through the bilateral mutual legal assistance treaty, and this is a very long and cumbersome process. So if data is localized, it's definitely going to help the law enforcement agencies. Second, it can also help us track cyber attacks. So it can help us keep a check on that. It can help us keep a check on the fake news as well. Then if there is data localization, it will also help the government to be able to tax the internet giants, because the government will exactly come to know what is the nature, what is the amount of their business, how much data is getting collected, so what is the size of the business, everything the government will come to know if the data is localized. So that will help the government to tax these internet giants. So next, again, this is this underlies this reinforces the principle of data sovereignty as well. Otherwise it could lead to data colonization. So it can prevent data colonization and promote data sovereignty. So these are some of the merits. When we talk about disadvantages, the first thing is that there can be intrusion into the privacy, reason being that there are several drawbacks with the consent itself. When we defining the fiduciaries, it has a wide definition. There are so many exemptions carved out. The definitions are vague and ambiguous. So this makes the bill a diluted version, and there could be intrusions. And also secondly, there is data localization. Because of data localization, it could increase the compliance cost, because these companies will now have to set up servers within the country, which again requires a lot of costs for the companies to set up the server rooms and all the infrastructure that is needed. So again, it will increase the compliance costs for the countries, and this could affect our ease of doing business also. The third thing is, these norms could end up hurting the young Indian startups itself, because they will also not have the wherewithal to invest so much in the infrastructure, the servers and all that. So if they have to localize the data that they need to send abroad, so it could even hurt the young Indian startups also. So these were some of the merits and the demerits related to this. So next we'll try to understand what is GDPR. Our entire data protection bill is based on the GDPR, which is General Data Protection Regulations. So these general data protection regulations, these are the European norms. So usually it is held that European norms are very stricter when it comes to the privacy of an individual. So they promote a very strong consent mechanism from the individuals. There is data portability, there is right to be forgotten. So this right to be forgotten right is very strong in the European regulations. And then there has to be also mandatory breach notification. So whenever a particular person's data security has been breached, then the fiduciary will have to compulsorily mandatorily notify that there is a data breach. So this is also there. But again, for a country like India, following such norms which are as strict as the GDPR could end up increasing the compliance cost too much. So the catch for India, a country like India, is to be able to balance between the privacy on the one hand and also open and having access to data, that transparency and ease of doing business on the other hand. So we need to balance the two. So this is very crucial for India when it comes to data protection. So with this, we will move to the next topic, is the oil price shock. So we have already seen in the previous videos a lot of data regarding the oil price shock, and also what will be the impact of the oil fall in the oil prices on India, both positive and negative. We have already seen that holistically. So here in this editorial was an important data that during the price fall of the oil, we should take advantage of it and we should fill our strategic petroleum reserves. At this point of time, our capacity of the reserve is only 5.3 million metric tons, which means just 9.5 days of our oil requirements. That's it. So government has also recently set up 2 additional strategic petroleum reserve facilities that will together amount to just 11.5 days of our country's crude requirements. But if you compare this to International Energy Agency, IEA country, then they will have to hold an emergency oil reserve that can sustain them for at least 90 days of imports. So even if they don't get 90 days of imports, they should be able to sustain it. That is the level of emergency oil holding that they have to do. So we should also work on similar lines, and we have to enhance our strategic petroleum reserve. So this was the only important part of the whole article. Now we'll move on. Next was a little data on hunger. So United Nations has said that last year there were nearly 135 hungry people, million hungry people across the world, and this year, because of the COVID crisis, we could probably add another 130 million hungry people. So the total could be 265 million would face acute food insecurity. So United Nations is making the World Food Program the United Nations World Food Program is making this estimate that this year 265 million people across the world could suffer from acute food insecurity. So this was data on food insecurity. Next is the Press Freedom Index. So Reporters Without Borders has come out with a Press Freedom Index, and we see that this has been falling for India. For example, in 2018, our ranking was 138. Then in 2019, it went on to 140, and then in 2020, it became 142. So it has only been increasing since then. So this is again an issue, so which needs to be tackled. So this is a data on Press Freedom Index. So next we will discuss about the yesterday's question. The question was to analyze the functioning of the local self-governance institutions in the country. So in the introduction, we will talk about the 73rd, 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, which provided a constitutional status to these local self-government institutions, that is the PRIs and the ULBs, Panchayati Raj institutions and urban local bodies, to strengthen them. So when we talk about the issues, the second ARC tells about divides these issues as 3 Fs: funds, functions and functionaries. But this has become very common, and these days everybody divides the issues as 3 Fs and writes it. So the examiner, if you see from his perspective, you would be bored to see in every answer there are 3 Fs. So try to avoid writing 3 Fs because it has become very common and everybody is writing. And I had come out with another categorization while I was preparing for public administration, but I have forgotten that now. But in this I'm going to tell you just in general, so you try to categorize it better. So first we will start from elections. So that is a starting point. Here not all the states are holding the elections regularly. So not all are holding elections regularly, and also there is this rural to urban migration that has happened in the last decade, which is on a high number. But still several wards in the municipal area are not even redrawn. So several places in, say, Maharashtra, for example Pune, where one ward may have 5 lakh people. So it is not very representative and not proportionate. So first is that elections are not held on time. Second, we have not considered the rural urban migration impact on the population per ward. So that has to be done. Then there is entrance of political parties also in the elections, because of which there is politicization of the elections at the village level. And because of this, there is corruption, there is voter bribery, and all of these issues have also come up. So this is all about the elections that you can mention. Then once they are elected, next comes what is their power and or how empowered are they. So here also you can talk about how, except few southern states in the devolution index that the Ministry of Panchayati Raj institutions comes out with, excluding few southern states, all other states fare very badly in the devolution index. So this is one thing. Then also because the actual devolution depends upon the acts enacted, the legislations enacted by each and every state. So not all the states have given them all the functions that have been mentioned under the corresponding schedules. Then the elected people are not aware of what their rights and what their duties are. For example, there is the Sarpanch Pati concept. So which means in the seats where, in those places where the seats are reserved for women get elected, but then it is very symbolical. The decisions are taken by the family's male members, and the women members only have a symbolic role there. And even when we see that in those constituencies where the seats are reserved for the SCs and the STs, there have been several case studies, several examples which show that even when the sarpanch belongs to a backward class, he or she is made to sit on the ground while the other panchayats are sitting on a desk or on a higher platform. So it indicating that even when the backward classes are getting elected, the social divisions in the rural areas are not going, and this is impacting the functions that a sarpanch has to perform. So all of these remain. So this you can talk about the power and or the empowerment of the panchayats. Then similarly you can talk about the funds. So when you talk about the funds, in funds you have two types. So one is that how much funds do these PRIs get, and two, how much funds do the PRIs generate. So on both the front there is a failure. They don't receive funds on time, there is always a delay. Then there is also mismanagement of funds. And when it comes to generating the funds, even economic survey has pointed out that the Panchayati Raj institutions generate nearly just 5% of their total fund requirement, and for ULBs it is nearly 45%. So they don't get also funds properly, and nor do they generate funds properly by collecting the taxes timely. So this is also there. Then next, the second ARC talks about an issue that is called as having an institutional jungle, which means there are several institutions apart from the Panchayati Raj institutions, and there is a overlap of functions, because of which the PRI's role and function in those areas is getting diluted, and there is on nobody you can fix accountability. For example, for several of the schemes like the smart cities and all, separate special purpose vehicles are being created. Even at the district level, there the district administration has several departments like water, agriculture, irrigation. So all of these again will overlap with the functions of the panchayats. So there is this institutional jungle. So because of which the responsibility cannot be given fully to the panchayats, and nor are they held accountable. Then also you can talk about the personnel. So how the personnel who are manning these positions, they are poor on motivation, they are not dedicated, they are corrupt, because there is in the United States there is a very prestigious municipal services, but that is not so the case in India. So their promotion prospects are poor, they are more corrupt. So all of these personal issues you can talk about. Then again, accountability. On accountability front also there is a failure. The social audit is poor. The CAG audit shows that several of the panchayats have been mismanaging the funds. You can talk about that. Then capacity building. Capacity building is again poor. Because they need to maintain their accounts, they need to plan, then they also have to use technologies like the internet, so which they are not aware, they do not know, and capacity has not been built regarding all of these. So you can talk about all of these issues, but whenever a question is asked to analyze the functioning, we also have to highlight the good things, the positive things. So you can take the example of Kerala, like we spoke yesterday, how empowered the local government in Kerala is. So you can quote that case study exactly. Then also Karnataka is one of the leaders in when it comes to empowering the local bodies. So there is in the state budget there is a separate demarcation for the local bodies, and whatever grants is meant for the local bodies, it goes through the banking channel directly. So these each of the panchayat, the bank accounts are there in the have all been connected, and the funds directly go to the bank accounts within a week or so. If it doesn't reach, then there will be penalties, and that means interest, with interest the amount will have to go. So all of these things are there. And also when I was preparing, that is 2018, Digambarpur Gram Panchayat in West Bengal had got the best Gram Panchayat award. So this is given by the Ministry of Panchayati Raj institutions. So check out every year which has got the best Gram Panchayat award, and take it as a case study that why it has got the best Gram Panchayat award. For example, Digambarpur got it because there was water conservation measures were taken, women empowerment measures were taken, waste management measures were taken. So all of these things you can say. Then also you can talk about technology. Several ULBs are using technology, like for example the Bangalore urban local body is using drones for property mapping because the property tax collection was falling. Similarly, Pune had issued the municipal bonds. So all of these is, and when I talk about Pune, yesterday itself we saw 2 examples of the Pune Zilla Parishad taking very good measures during COVID. So all of these things are there. And now after the 14th Finance Commission and all the performance grants are being given to the urban local bodies based on their performance. Then there is electronic fund transfer. The devolution index is kind of giving a sense of competition. Capacity building and training is also being emphasized. So all these positive things also you can highlight. So now we will see today's question. Critically analyze the role played by NHRC in protecting and promoting the human rights in India. So please do for my mental frame at least. So that's for today. Thank you.